I am Emily Harper, 30 years old, a woman born into wealth and power, but never allowed to be buried in that glittering shell. Sharpness and independence, qualities that seem impossible to take root in the world of the hidden conventions of the upper class, have become my armor for survival. This morning, I stand in the living room of the Harper Mansion, where every carved line, every faded wall seems to carry the soul of time, keeping stories that were never allowed to be spoken. This is more than a house. It is a shrine to memory, a living museum that records the aura and suffocating pressure of our family. Magnificent, powerful, and also suffocatingly harsh. Outside, Seattle has just stopped a gloomy drizzle. A drizzle that is as steady and persistent as a long whisper of the past. A thin mist still lingers, wrapping around the skyscrapers like a fragile scarf around the neck of a lady past her prime. In the distance, Puget Sound reflected the pale light of dawn, as if the city were stirring with a reluctant, languid wakefulness. In the room that blended classic and modern, the dark walnut polished to a mirrored finish, the fire crackling in the old stone fireplace, something was quietly shifting. The air was stagnant, thick, as if the beauty of the place could not conceal a storm brewing. My father, Michael, stood before the fireplace, his tall figure now covered with an indescribable uncertainty. His face, usually the image of an ambitious businessman's confidence and pride, was now marked by tension, even suppressed anger. His eyes shifted between his watch and the wide window, where the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore reminded him of the reality he was trying to avoid. Michael, the only son of William Harper, founder of the Harper Industries empire, had always had a thirst for self-assertion, but fate seemed to have given him a long slide from hope to disappointment. The multi-million-dollar deals he had dreamed of had burst like soap bubbles, leaving behind him mounting debts and a tarnished reputation. The looming shadow of his grandfather had weighed heavily on him, turning my father into a man prone to anger, suspicion, and increasingly alienated from his own family. My mother, Clara, an interior designer with refined taste, sat silently on the green velvet sofa, her hands clasping a cup of tea that had long since cooled. She was the keeper of the family fire, the one who tried to mend the cracks torn by time and ambition. Her face was deeply tired, but her eyes tried to maintain a calm, as if to calm the storm brewing in the room. She looked at my father, then at my sister Sophie, with a gentle, warning gaze. The relationship between my mother and my grandfather had been built on a deep respect for art and beauty, and that made my father feel even more excluded from the circle of family heritage. Sophie, my younger sister, was sitting next to my mother, her eyes glued to the phone screen, her fingers lightly swiping away a quiet anxiety. Occasionally, she glanced around with a half-innocent, half-calculating gaze. Sophie had always been someone who lived off the family, enjoying the comfort of the Harper name rather than trying to preserve or develop it. She had no great aspirations, only wanting to live a peaceful life under the shade of her inheritance. That made me worry, because I knew clearly, one day that dependence would become an indelible burden. The doorbell rang, sharp and abrupt, like a knife cutting through the tense silence. Attorney James Carter, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit and shiny gold-rimmed glasses, walked in with dignity. He bowed slightly and placed his black leather briefcase on the ebony coffee table. The moment we had all been waiting for had arrived, the reading of William Harper's will. My grandfather's death 2 weeks ago shook the foundations that seemed immovable. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a great empire and countless unanswered questions. Even though he lived to be 90, his passing was still a huge shock, because he was the pillar, the soul, the one who turned each brick into power. As James Carter opened his briefcase and read the first lines of the will in a deep, suffocating voice, the room was filled with a thick, suffocating atmosphere. Each word rang out like a bell tolling for fate. My father, who had tried to appear indifferent at first, suddenly changed his expression when the division of the estate was read. The tension was palpable in every little movement, from the tightness of his lips to the uncertain fluttering of his eyes, as if he were praying for a light at the end of the tunnel. And then, the unexpected happened. The bulk of the assets, including a huge cash pile and a majority stake in Harper Industries, were not split equally between Michael and Sophie, as everyone assumed. It was all handed down to me, Emily Harper. The room went silent. My father's eyes, already dark with suspicion, burned with unbridled rage. He roared, then suddenly lunged at the table where James Carter had placed a copy of the $25 million inheritance papers. Without hesitation, he tore them into tiny pieces, as if he could destroy the harsh reality with his own trembling hands. The white pieces of paper flew through the air, falling to the wooden floor like wilted petals after a fierce wind. My mother gasped, and Sophie froze, her eyes wide with surprise. All eyes turned to me, waiting for a reaction. Anger, confusion, hurt, or at least hesitation. But I just smiled. A faint, undefined smile, but enough to make Michael stop in his tracks. It wasn't mocking or arrogant, but a quiet, deliberate smile. Calm and steady, as if I had expected this, or had been ready for it all along. My calmness in the midst of chaos made the silence all the more oppressive. My father looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: anger, disbelief, and confusion. He couldn't explain how I could stand so still in the face of what he had just caused, the destruction of what he had once taken for granted. And in that moment, I knew my journey had just begun. Grandfather William's death was not simply the end of a great man's life. It was an invitation to a new chapter, one in which I would have to confront my family, my ambitions, my resistance, and the ghosts of my past, to find out what his legacy meant to me, and to all those caught up in this maelstrom of power. My composure during the reading of the will was not the result of indifference or lack of emotion. On the contrary, it was the result of a solid foundation, forged through the deep memories and invaluable lessons that my grandfather William had taught me throughout my childhood. There was a special bond between us, a silent language of understanding and harmony that no one else in the family had ever touched. He was not only my grandfather, but also my teacher, my confidant, the greatest inspiration that ever lit up the dark corners of my soul. I still vividly remember the bright, pale, sunlit weekend mornings in Volunteer Park, a lush green oasis in the heart of bustling Seattle. I was a little girl of about 6 or 7 years old, my tiny hand tightly holding Grandpa William's big hand. He was tall, his hair was already streaked with gray, but his demeanor always exuded a calm warmth. We walked under the rows of ancient trees, where the light sparkled through the leaves and the chirping of birds was like a whisper of nature. He often wore a gray wool coat, simple but dignified, and every step with him was a step into the fascinating world of adulthood. His hands were rough with age, but when placed on my shoulders, they were strangely gentle, as if they could protect the small universe within me. He didn't tell me fancy fairy tales, nor did he indulge me with childish games like other adults. Instead, he talked to me about business, not in the rigid language of spreadsheets or contracts, but in a language as familiar and lively as the scenery around us. Once, when we stopped under a giant tree, he pointed to the tangled roots and said, "You see, a tree stands strong because its roots are deep. A company is the same. If it wants to last, it can't just take care of the foliage. It has to build a deep, solid foundation." The things he said, simple yet profound, gradually shaped my view of the world. He taught me the value of service, of creating something meaningful for the community, rather than just chasing profits. "Money is just a tool, Emily," he said, his voice deep echoing in my mind. "What matters is what you do to change the world, what you do to make other people's lives better." Those words planted in me a different concept of success, one that was not about numbers, but about responsibility, purpose, and positive impact. During each walk, he talked about Harper Industries, not as a profit-making machine, but as a living organism that he tended to every day. He told me about the difficult startup period, the sleepless nights spent brainstorming, and the seemingly insurmountable failures. He wanted me to understand that the road to success was not paved with roses, but with resilience, learning, and the courage to never give up. He encouraged me to ask questions, to explore, to always doubt the obvious. "Never settle for the easiest answer," he emphasized, because the truth is often hidden in many layers. Knowledge is not just power, it is a compass. It was those simple moments that ignited a deep love for business in me, not as a money race, but as a journey of creativity, building, and problem solving. I was passionate about analyzing the market, devising strategies, connecting seemingly disparate ideas into a big picture. I believed I had the ability to see far and understand deeply, an ability that my grandfather nurtured with his passionate heart. But those quiet walks, those inspiring conversations became a silent rift between me and my father, Michael. As William's only son, he had always yearned for recognition, to inherit the halo of his great father. He had devoted himself to following the path his grandfather had opened, but it seemed that those efforts were never enough to overcome the great shadow that was looming over him. Although he loved Michael, his grandfather had set cruelly high expectations for himself, a measure that my father always felt he could not reach. And when he saw me, a young granddaughter, being given the time, wisdom, and affection of the person he always wanted to understand, a silent jealousy took root. I remember my grandfather explaining supply chains to me using the analogy of a train passing through a park. My father happened to be walking by, his eyes fixed on us, a gaze that held a myriad of emotions: doubt, hurt, and an indescribable helplessness. He stood there for a moment, then quietly turned away. I was too young to understand, but I could clearly sense that something had broken, a thin but deep rift that had grown silently over time, stretching the gap between generations. My joy in learning from my grandfather was my father's silent pain. He never got the advice that I had, nor the chance to walk leisurely under the ancient trees, hand in hand with his once figurative father. Instead, he had to strain himself to reach an unattainable standard, and each failure was a cut to his already fractured self-esteem. My grandfather loved Michael. I never doubted that. But that love was accompanied by a strictness, with criticism that not everyone could bear. And so every time my father called me the true heir, there was sadness in his eyes, a sadness that was overwhelmed by jealousy. Even though I never wanted it, fate chose me and inadvertently drove us apart. If my grandfather's memories were a warm glow that illuminated my mind, my father, Michael, was always a dark, dark picture. As the only son of William Harper, my father should have inherited the glory and favor of a great family. But for him, the title was like an oversized coat, gorgeous but suffocating, that he could never fit into. He lived in his father's shadow, and the pressure to prove his worth eroded him, leaving him a man full of ambition but also full of insecurity, like a flame that was always afraid of being extinguished. I still remember vividly one night when I was a girl of 12 or 13. I was awakened by a noise coming from my grandfather's study downstairs, the sacred space in Harper Manor, where old books, plans, and conversations were kept off limits to outsiders. I crept downstairs, each step sinking into the thick carpet. The study door was ajar, letting in my father's voice, harsh and laced with anger and hurt. "Don't you believe me, William?" His voice was hoarse, choked with repression. "I did everything you asked me to do. I tried without stopping. But what about you? You never really saw me. You only saw Emily, only saw her as someone capable." My heart pounded. I had never heard my father speak to my grandfather in that tone. It wasn't simply an argument, but an outburst of resentment, of a yearning for recognition after years of neglect. My grandfather, the man I had always known for his calm and dignified demeanor, sounded tired, but his voice was as steady as steel. "Michael, it's not that I don't believe in you, but you've always been caught up in the flashy, temporary things instead of building a solid foundation. You lack the patience and vision that I spent my whole life teaching you." "You've been patient enough," my father almost shouted. "You've waited, you've given your all to each project. But what about me? You taught Emily everything that should have been mine. You treated her like an heir, when I was your real son." I huddled behind the heavy wooden door, feeling like an intruder in a very personal pain. My father's words didn't make me angry. They made me choke. Behind that anger was a grown son who had never felt proud of his father. And tragically, I, with all that I had, my independence, my sharpness, had inadvertently become evidence of what my father lacked. Since that night, I have come to understand that the rivalry between my father and I was no accident. It was a long, simmering rift, rooted in his feeling overshadowed by his own daughter, while my grandfather lavished on me the praise and expectations that once belonged to him. Michael was the man who bore the burden of the Harper name. He studied hard. graduated from prestigious schools, and entered the business world with the desire to prove himself. But he always stumbled, from taking on too much, from not being careful, or sometimes simply because luck was not on his side. I remember one time when my father invested in a hot technology project. Despite my grandfather's warnings about the risks and lack of transparency, Michael followed his instincts. The project failed, causing huge losses for Harper Industries, and my grandfather had to step in to save the situation. It was a painful fall, not only financially, but also in terms of self-esteem. I, a young girl with new ideas and natural confidence, made my father even more uneasy. My grandfather made no secret of his appreciation for my analytical and strategic thinking abilities. He often included me in important meetings, asked me about the company's strategy, and even took me to factories, trips that should have been reserved for heirs. These things, though not my fault, were like salt in the wound. Michael saw in me a better version of himself, one capable of reaching heights he could only dream of. This made him bitter, trying to put me down or at least ignore my achievements. Whenever I made progress, he would respond with a cold nod or a casual remark. "Not bad, but are you sure you can keep up the good work?" That competition ran deep in our relationship, beyond the limits of jealousy. It was the pain of a son who never felt good enough in his father's eyes, and who bitterly took that inadequacy out on his daughter, the one he was supposed to love and protect. I knew my father was under a lot of pressure, but the way he dealt with it, the jealousy, the coldness, left me feeling helpless, at times distant like two strangers. That night in the study was not only his outburst, but also the first time I saw clearly the deep scars in the soul of the man I called my father. Amidst the heavy family picture of dark colors of rivalry, hurt and pressure from generation to generation, my mother, Clara, appears as a gentle touch. A woman with a soft but strong heart, always trying to calm the storms between generations. As an interior designer with a refined aesthetic taste and a delicate eye for the smallest details, my mother possesses a tolerant heart that always tries to connect lonely souls, even in the most uncertain moments. The relationship between my mother and my grandfather William has always touched me. A rare bond in the family, woven of a shared passion for art and mutual respect. Unlike my father, who measured the value of everything in spreadsheets and profits, my mother saw in my grandfather a seasoned artist, a man who was still passionate about beauty and creativity. I still remember the soft, yellow-lit evenings when my grandfather and my mother sat in the living room, immersed in conversations about Baroque architecture, the color schemes of Renaissance paintings, or the lines of an antique piece of furniture. His voice was no longer stern, but calm, light as the wind at the end of the day, as he told of his trips to European museums or the works he had once loved. My mother listened deeply, sometimes smiling slightly, adding a few subtle comments like the final brushstrokes to complete a painting. Between them exists a private space, separate from the hustle and bustle of the business world, where grandfather finds a rare kindred spirit, someone who understands and shares values that go beyond money. Because of this affinity, Michael, my father, felt increasingly lost and distant. He could not penetrate the metaphorical artistic world that his mother and grandfather had built together. As they immersed themselves in composition and color, Michael would often just pass by with a bewildered look, like someone standing outside a door unable to enter. He felt himself being pushed away from a core part of his father's soul, a part that he longed to belong to, but could not reach. My mother, all those years, was the only one who witnessed Michael's failures without saying a word. With his endless ambition, my father threw himself into reckless investments without any solid preparation. Whenever a deal failed, he would return home in silent despair, and my mother would be the first to know. But she did not scold, did not accuse, she just listened silently, comforted, and then quietly resolved the consequences. My mother always tried to hide the truth from my grandfather, not to cover up, but because she feared that the disappointment from the father Michael had always tried to conquer would completely destroy him. I still vividly remember the time my father invested in a fast food restaurant chain, hoping to build his own business empire. But due to poor management and lack of experience, the project quickly failed. He was devastated, almost hiding from the world, especially his grandfather. At that time, my mother stood up to take responsibility. lying to my grandfather that the project only had minor problems and needed time to recover. Even more heartbreaking, she secretly withdrew her personal savings to cover the huge loss, not because of blind faith in her husband's ability, but because of unconditional love and a desire to protect him from the cruel reality. Not only did she protect my father, she was also the one who shielded me from the wind and storm, especially during the years when my father began to see my presence as a threat. When he was agitated by my academic achievements or the compliments I received, his invisible anger often poured out in cold looks or unnamed reprimands. And it was my mother, with a quiet courage, who stood between me and that rage. Sometimes she gently took me out, away from the heavy atmosphere, sometimes just a soft word to calm the heat. She did not want me to grow up feeling threatened by my own family, did not want those unreasonable angers to be imprinted on my soul like indelible scratches. I can never forget those childhood nights when I heard the sounds of arguing in the study from my bedroom, the harsh sounds weighing heavily on my little heart. My mother would quietly come in, sit next to my bed, gently stroke my hair and whisper, "Don't worry, everything will be fine. Just be yourself. Do what you believe is right." She never told me about my father's humiliating failures or the tense arguments with my grandfather, but I understood. In each of those gentle gestures was a heart that had endured more than anyone else, a heart that never let itself complain, because the only thing my mother always put first was her family. In a world where wealth and power can overshadow compassion, my mother, Clara, quietly holds on to the most fragile light: love. She taught me that true power lies not in possession, but in the ability to maintain connections between people. She is patient as the earth, tolerant as the sky, and loves without asking for anything in return. She is the place I turn to in my darkest hours, the one who helped me stay calm on that fateful day of reading my will. Because as long as she is there, I know there is always a safe place, a heart that will never turn its back on me. The pressure from my father, Michael, was always like an invisible string that held me tight, pulling me toward the expectations he had always nurtured, that I should pursue art, or at least a field of study that had nothing to do with the dry business world. He was desperate for me to avoid a field that he considered full of pitfalls and pain, where he had experienced both glory and failure. Perhaps more deeply, he did not want me to continue the invisible journey that had overshadowed him, or simply, he wanted me to avoid the wounds that had never healed. "Emily, you have your mother's eyes, your artist's hands," he often said. "You should be drawing, you should be designing, not touching those lifeless numbers." Yet during those quiet afternoons spent walking around Volunteer Park with my grandfather William, another seed had quietly sprouted in my soul. I did not want to live on the beaten path laid out by others. I was not born to be a gentle copy of expectations, but to find my own path. My passion did not come from colors or soft lines, but from numbers, strategies, and the uncompromising mind games of the financial markets. It was not a passing fancy, but the crystallization of my nights absorbed in reading economics books, my market-watching sessions with my grandfather, and my quiet analysis of the financial reports he left on his desk. When it came time to choose a college, I found myself in a fierce tug-of-war between my heart and my father's will. On one side was what he wanted. On the other was my desire to be true to myself. In the end, I chose finance at the University of Washington. Not just as an academic choice, but as a silent declaration. I was going to live my own life. I didn't want to hide behind the shadow of Harper Industries or the prestigious name my family had built. I wanted to prove my worth through my own ability and personal character. My father's reaction, as expected, was to explode like a smoldering fire. He saw it as a betrayal, an open rebellion against all the expectations he had placed on him. "What do you want me to do, Emily?" he roared in the middle of a tense dinner. "Are you going to throw away everything I've taught you? Are you going to struggle in this cruel sea alone without a family?" My mother tried to lighten the mood, but I quietly held firm. I knew I was on the right path, and that it, though arduous, was the only path that would make me feel like myself. In stark contrast to my father's harsh reaction, Grandpa William quietly called me into his study late one evening. He poured me a cup of hot tea, his eyes filled with affection. "You have chosen a more difficult path, Emily, but I believe you are strong enough to go all the way. Don't be afraid. Go ahead and show the world who you are. His gaze, warm, clear, and full of faith, was a priceless spiritual gift. Without imposing, without forcing, he just quietly gave me freedom, backed by unconditional love. After graduating with honors, I received numerous offers from major financial firms, including Harper Industries. My father was delighted to offer me a senior position in the company, hoping that I would eventually return to the family. He described it as the quickest, safest, and most secure way for me to start. But I declined. Once again, I disappointed him. This time, the anger was colder, like a silent knife cutting into his heart. He thought I didn't appreciate what my grandfather had built, that I was destroying my own legacy. "You're going to destroy it all, Emily?" he asked, his voice bitter. "What do you think you can do without Harper's protection?" But I had a plan. I decided to start over, joining a fledgling financial firm in downtown Seattle. No name recognition, no fancy title, no dream salary, but it had what I needed: opportunity. I wasn't looking for instant glory. I was looking for a place to learn, to start from scratch and build everything with my own hands. I don't want to succeed because of my inherited privilege, but because of my true ability. I want to stand on my own 2 feet, with intelligence, diligence, and courage. That choice is not only a turning point in my career, but also a milestone in my journey to adulthood. It is a declaration to break away from all stereotypes and pressures, to walk on the path that I have written myself. When he heard the news, my grandfather just smiled and said, "You did the right thing, Emily. I believe you will fly high and far." Those words were like a blessing, a bright light illuminating my path. In his eyes, I read something deeper than pride. It was understanding. He understood the desire for freedom, the hunger for challenges, for self-affirmation. And it was from that belief that I had more strength to move forward, not only towards success, but also towards a life that was meaningful and worthy of the person I wanted to become. While I was diligently laying the foundations for my own independence, my younger sister Sophie chose a completely opposite path. Since childhood, Sophie loved comfort and ease, and she never hid her enjoyment of life based on the Harper family's prestige and fortune. While I embarked on difficult challenges, Sophie was absorbed in lavish parties, lavish shopping, and fleeting relationships. She lived without any specific ideals, other than maintaining the glamorous facade of a Harper. Sophie and I never really bonded. We grew up in the same house, but we seemed to belong to different universes. I valued independence, perseverance, and the feeling of building my own success. Sophie, on the other hand, believed that life was meant to be enjoyed, and that the name Harper was enough to spare her from effort. Effort was foreign to her. That fragile relationship finally fell apart when I discovered that Sophie had been secretly using money from Harper Industries' charitable foundation for her own personal use. I only found out by chance when I was reviewing her financial statements, a habit I had long had, partly out of curiosity and partly because my grandfather had occasionally asked me to review certain items. When I confronted her, Sophie was not only unrepentant, but also resentful, as if I had invaded her privacy. "I only borrowed a little, Emily," Sophie said, her voice laced with reproach. "I'll pay it back. What's the big deal? It's our family's money, after all." I looked at my sister silently, my heart heavy with disappointment. "No, Sophie, that's not personal money. It's the company's charity fund. You can't use it so carelessly. You're breaking the rules, and this seriously affects the reputation of Harper Industries." Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes flashing with provocation. "Fame? You're always concerned with that invisible thing. Do you think you're so noble? Everyone relies on their family's money. What's the difference? You're just pretending to be virtuous, but you've definitely never made a mistake." I had to swallow my anger to keep my composure. "This isn't just a personal mistake, Sophie. This is a matter of ethics. Grandpa put his trust in that foundation. You're hurting the thing he holds most dear." Sophie laughed, a bitter laugh. "Grandpa? He never really saw me. In his eyes, there was only you, the perfect granddaughter. And I was always the shadow. Do you know how hard I tried? I just wanted to be free, to live happily on my own terms." She started blaming me, accusing me of being disloyal to the family, not understanding the pressure she was under. You always side with him, with those rigid principles. Have you ever thought about my feelings? I have been compared to you so many times. The model daughter that my grandfather always admired. You never offered to help me, only tried to hinder me. Sophie's words were like needles piercing my heart. I had never thought that my efforts to be kind could become a burden to my loved ones. But I also knew that if I turned a blind eye, it would open the door to further wrongdoing. I couldn't do that. I refused to cover up Sophie's actions and forced her to face the consequences herself. You have to take responsibility for your actions, Sophie, I said firmly. You need to pay back the money and take this as a lesson. No one can live in forgiveness forever. What did you say? Sophie burst into tears, her eyes filled with anger and grievance. Are you going to abandon me? Do you know what Dad would do if he found out? You are no longer my sister. You betrayed the family. From that moment on, there was an irreparable rift between us. Sophie became distant and cold. She saw me as an enemy instead of the sister she grew up with. She didn't understand that what I did wasn't to reject her, but to teach her independence and responsibility. That incident exposed the gap in values between us. I believed in transparency, in the power of self-reliance and honest work. Sophie lived in the belief of privilege, that she could spend and enjoy without paying the price. She did not see that a family name could be a shield, but also a knife that could cut the bearer if not respected. After that incident, I realized a painful truth. Even in the same family, not everyone shares the same set of values. There are limits that even blood relatives cannot overcome. Sometimes maintaining integrity is more important than holding on to a rotting relationship. The confrontation with Sophie taught me that honesty is not only a duty to others, but also a promise to yourself. And sometimes the price of being right is a deep cut in the heart, but also the beginning of an inevitable journey of maturity. My life continued to flow in the hustle and bustle of work at a startup financial company, where I devoted all my heart to learning, to asserting myself in a competitive environment. The relationship between me and my father and Sophie was still limited to social conversations, stifled by distance, filled with misunderstandings that had never been resolved. Then one day, the bad news about my grandfather William's illness came like a fatal blow. He was found to have a serious heart condition and was immediately transferred to Seattle Medical Center, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. As soon as I heard the news, I immediately put aside all my work and rushed to the hospital. The first sight when I entered the hospital room made my heart ache. My grandfather, the strong and resilient man I had always respected, was now lying there weak and pale on the white bed. His silver hair was as thin as the thin clouds of late autumn. His face was deeply wrinkled by time and pain. The rhythmic sound of medical machines, each beep seemed to emphasize each fragile beat of life, creating a persistent sad melody that haunted the room. In the following days, I almost moved into the hospital, staying by his bedside from morning till night. I read to him, told him about my work, about the new projects I was working on, the obstacles I encountered, and the first small successes I had. Although he did not say much, his tired eyes still shone with attention and pride. Sometimes he squeezed my hand, a silent squeeze but filled with a solemn transference, as if he were passing on to me the last of his remaining strength. In the quiet evenings, as I watched him fall asleep, my mind drifted back to my childhood years, where I sat beside him, listening to his lessons of courage, integrity, and perseverance. I understood then that although he had built a powerful empire, the most valuable thing he left me was not material wealth, but his principles of life, his strong belief in my own worth. I am grateful to him for always encouraging me to follow my own path, for seeing in me something my father had never seen. While I almost forgot myself for him, my father, Michael, and Sophie only appeared intermittently, each time with an awkwardness. They came when the situation became serious, when his illness could no longer be hidden. My father entered with a forced tension on his face, asked perfunctory questions, and then quickly withdrew, as if his presence in the hospital was a suffocating burden. Sophie, on the other hand, appeared with expensive flowers and a standard smile, said a few empty words of comfort, and took a few photos to post on social media before quickly leaving. I felt their coldness and indifference. Heartbreaking, but not a word of reproach came out. I focused only on the only thing I believed was important: being with him in his final moments. One afternoon, while I was reading to him, he suddenly grabbed my hand. His eyes stared at me, serious and urgent. His voice was weak but clear. "Emily, you must be careful of opportunists in your own family." My heart skipped a beat. I knew who he was talking about. Grandpa had seen it all: Michael's smoldering greed, Sophie's false dependence, and perhaps plots I had never dared to imagine. "They will find a way to take what I left. You must stand firm. You must protect everything." I nodded, my eyes brimming with tears, trying to hold back my sobs. "I understand, Grandpa. I promise. I won't let anything get in the way." He smiled weakly, a smile heavy with faith, and continued, as if in a last breath. "I have prepared a secret plan to protect you and what belongs to us. Trust in me." I was speechless. A secret plan? What had he been secretly preparing, without telling anyone? Not even me? I wanted to ask more, but he had closed his eyes. His breathing was getting shallow. I squeezed his hand, feeling the last warmth leave his bony hand. I knew that was his last message, a warning, a last wish, and an absolute trust in me. After that night, my grandfather's health rapidly deteriorated. A few days later, he left this world in a gentle sleep, as peaceful as he had lived his life, a life of dignity and composure. His passing left a deep void in me, but also planted in me a seed of curiosity and iron determination. I understood that the real battle had only just begun. I would have to face opportunists who claimed to be relatives, would have to stand up to protect what my grandfather had left behind, and above all, I would have to find out the secret plan he had mentioned. 2 weeks after William's grandfather's death, the will was read at the law firm James Carter, a modern glass building in downtown Seattle, whose polished walls reflected the cold light of the city like a mirror to one's fate. In stark contrast to the warm but tense atmosphere of the Harper mansion, this place exuded an eerie coldness, a sense of detachment and aloofness that seemed designed to strip the legal process of all emotion. I arrived early, sitting quietly in a black leather chair, trying to maintain composure as my heart churned. Michael and Sophie entered later, with Clara's mother between them, a fragile attempt to connect 3 broken lives with gentle glances and gestures. No one spoke to anyone, and a thick silence quickly filled the room like an impenetrable fog. Attorney James Carter, white-haired and unwrinkled in his suit, entered with his usual neatness. He placed a thick file on the table, took a deep breath, and began to read. His voice was steady and clear, echoing in the space filled with the hum of the air conditioner, an emotionless soundtrack to the family drama waiting to unfold. He skimmed through the sections dealing with the assets, investments, and charitable foundations his grandfather had painstakingly built up. Michael sat up straight, his eyes fixed on the attorney, as if trying to draw out every word. He coughed occasionally, not from illness, but from gnawing impatience. Sophie couldn't hide her boredom. She twisted the silver bracelet around her wrist, her eyes lost. As Mr. James read the key part about Harper Industries, the tension in the room became suffocating, like a string pulled to the breaking point. Michael began to fidget, his eyes flashing with a mixture of desire and calculation. He was sure of his place, the only son, the heir apparent, the rightful owner of the corporate throne. His entire life had been a series of waiting for this moment, the moment when he would step up and take over the legacy that he considered his unquestioned right. And then, Attorney James paused, clearing his throat as if to mark the decisive moment. In accordance with the final wishes of Mr. William Harper, the entire $25 million and a 60% controlling stake in Harper Industries will be transferred to Miss Emily Harper. The room fell into a paralyzing silence, a silence that felt as if there had been an explosion and no one had heard the sound. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. I could hear my heart beating in my chest like a war drum. Michael, who had been calm until now, suddenly stood up like a compressed spring. His face paled, then quickly flushed with anger. His eyes widened, scanning me with the look of a betrayed man, as if I had just taken his life. "What?" he roared, his voice filled with anger and shock. "No way. He can't do that. My daughter? Instead of his own son? This is a terrible joke." James Carter remained coldly calm. "Mr. Michael, this is a legal, notarized will. All the terms were personally drafted and signed by Mr. William." But Michael could no longer take in any words. His anger had overtaken all rationality. He lunged at the table where the document lay like a deed of power he had refused to accept. He snatched the copy of the certificate, the paper with my name and the words confirming my inheritance, as if tearing it up would make the truth disappear. His eyes burned with a wild fire. "I will never accept this," he shouted, raising the paper as if to throw the whole world into the fire. "I will destroy it all." And then there was a deafening sound, the sound of paper being torn in two. Michael had torn the document to shreds, the pieces of paper flying like wilted petals from a flower, falling to the cold office floor like the remains of a delusion. The action was both dramatic and desperate, a punch in the air. Clara's mother let out a soft cry, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes filled with panic as she looked at her ex-husband who was falling apart before her. Sophie sat there, her eyes so wide that she looked like she could burst into tears at any moment. The room turned into a chaotic stage, but in the midst of all that chaos, I found myself emerging from the storm. I stood there, strangely calm. I looked at Michael, at the scraps of paper at his feet, and a small smile crossed my lips. Not a smile of triumph or of derision, but the smile of someone who knew all too well what was happening. A smile of someone who had seen the future through the eyes of the dead. I knew my grandfather had expected this moment. He would not have left me power unprepared. That smile made Michael stop. He looked at me, his eyes wavering between anger, disbelief, and fear. He couldn't understand my calm, couldn't understand why I wasn't angry, not panicked, not surprised. He felt like he was facing something bigger than himself, something he couldn't control. In that moment, I realized that the will was more than just a legal document. It was a profound message from my grandfather, a warning, a final test. And for me, it was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one in which I would face my father's wrath, my sister's jealousy, and the weight of my legacy. But I was not afraid. I knew that my grandfather had prepared me for this path, and I, with all my respect and understanding, would never let him down. After Michael and Sophie and my mother, Clara, had left the office, leaving behind a whirlwind of emotions and shredded papers strewn across the floor, Attorney James Carter looked at me with a secret smile, as if he had just witnessed a scene he had anticipated for a long time. I sat there, motionless, strangely calm, as if the storm that had just swept through had not been enough to shake me. James waited until the door had closed completely, then slowly turned to me, his eyes filled with admiration. "Miss Emily, I must say, your composure impressed me," he said in a low, sincere voice. "Mr. Michael's reaction. I expected it, but I didn't expect it to be so dramatic." I just nodded, my voice soft as an acknowledgement. "My grandfather warned me, Mr. Carter." Attorney James walked slowly to his desk, picking up the pieces of paper that Michael had torn apart in his uncontrolled rage. He looked at them for a moment, then placed them in the steel trash can under the desk. Returning to his seat, he opened a drawer, took out a thin tablet, and quietly turned it on. "William was an extraordinary man, Emily," he began, his voice full of reverence and regret. "He had a vision, a kind heart, and a sharp mind. He was not only a brilliant businessman, but also a thoughtful father and grandfather, with a keen understanding of the individuality of his family." He paused as if searching for the right words. And he anticipated the reaction, especially Michael's, when the will was revealed. I felt my heart beat faster. Finally, this was the secret plan that my grandfather had mentioned. the one I had always thought was just a metaphor. A cold, burning electric current ran down my spine. So, what's the plan, sir? I asked softly. My voice almost caught in my throat. Mr. James smiled, a smile somewhere between admiration and reverence. That's it, Emily. He gently touched the tablet screen. William completed the transfer of his assets 3 months ago when he learned that his illness was terminal. The $25 million and 60% of Harper Industries were legally transferred to you. Michael's tearing up of his will was a meaningless impulse, an empty symbol, nothing more. I was stunned, not by the huge amount of money or the powerful stake, but by my grandfather's terrifying foresight and meticulous preparation. He had foreseen every reaction, every detail, and every impulsive action of my father, which turned out to be all part of a long calculated game. He had protected me not only from my father's greed, but also from the endless legal battles that could have broken me. Mr. James pressed a button. The screen showed my grandfather, William Harper, sitting in the familiar study where I had spent hours reading as a child. Behind him was a blazing fireplace and bookshelves that reached to the ceiling. He looked thinner, his eyes deeper, but still as clear and determined as ever. Hey, Emily, if you're watching this, it means my plan worked out exactly as planned. His voice rang out, deep and warm, taking me back to an old winter afternoon, huddled by the fireplace, listening to him tell his story. I know this will come as a surprise to you, but I had no choice. I knew Michael would never accept the truth, and I didn't want you to endure an unnecessary legal battle after I left. He coughed, his eyes softening. My dear daughter, you are my greatest pride. You have intelligence, courage, and a compassionate heart. You have proven that you can stand on your own 2 feet without relying on anyone, something Michael never learned. I see in you a true ability to lead Harper Industries not only to economic growth, but also to become a symbol of morality and human values. He frowned slightly, his voice low with concern. You'll feel pressure. Michael will try to make things difficult for you. Sophie may find ways to lean on him. But you have to stay strong, Emily. Remember, my legacy is not just about numbers. It's about my reputation, my credibility, and the values I've worked so hard to build over my lifetime. You're the one who will inherit that. He looked straight into the camera, as if through time, looking straight at me. I have entrusted the future of the company to you. Lead with your mind and your heart. Don't be afraid of challenges, and believe that I am always with you, in your memories, in your decisions, and in every step. His voice was tight, full of love. I love you, Emily. Do what you believe is right. The screen went black. I sat still, motionless. Tears fell down my cheeks, not because of pure emotion, but because I felt a sacred bond between me and him, stronger than any will, any possession. He had left me not only power, but also absolute trust and an inescapable responsibility. Mr. James quietly turned off the screen. William has spent months mapping out every step, he said, his voice softening. He wants to make sure you're completely protected, and that no one can turn the tables. He has a team of financial and legal advisors behind you. I nodded slightly, wiping away my tears. So, my father can't interfere at all? That's right, Mr. James confirmed without hesitation. The entire transfer is complete. What Mr. Michael showed was hopeless helplessness. You are the only one with complete control of Harper Industries. A mixture of relief and heaviness washed over me. I knew. The real battle had only just begun. But I was not alone. My grandfather had placed in my hands a sword and a shield, a lifetime's worth of trust and legacy. Now it was my responsibility to protect what he had built with all my might, wisdom, and integrity. I would not back down. I would lead Harper Industries into the future, the way my grandfather had dreamed. After leaving James Carter's law office, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to the headquarters of my financial startup, which still smelled of my own youthful passion and idealism. The revelations about my grandfather's secret plans were still swirling in my head, making my mind spin like it had just emerged from a storm. But I knew. I didn't have time to sit there and think. The burden my grandfather had left me was not only a serious burden, but also a window into the opportunity to shape a legacy. I needed to understand the current picture of Harper Industries before making any decisions, no matter how small. I threw myself into a high-intensity work cycle for days on end, working closely with the team of financial advisors my grandfather had handpicked. They were seasoned minds who had accompanied him on countless strategic projects. We reviewed every financial report, audit, contract, and investment file. Not a single line was left unturned. I was eager to see the true picture of the empire I had just inherited without embellishment or concealment. And the picture is bleak. Under Michael's leadership, Harper Industries had been on a downward spiral of failures. Ill-considered investments, hasty decisions, and lack of management depth were evident on every page. One giant technology project in particular, artificial intelligence, in which he had poured tens of millions of dollars into, as if he were betting the company's fate. The project had been hyped, painted with a bold vision, but lacked technical foundation or market strategy. Michael had ignored expert warnings and rushed into it with an arrogant confidence, an act more about proving his abilities to his grandfather than about the future of the company. I still remember the old admonition, never put all your eggs in one basket, Emily, and do your research before you put all your money into anything. Ambition is necessary, but blind recklessness is the biggest trap for young people. But Michael did the exact opposite. He put all his hopes and resources into a risky gamble, neglecting the pillars of the business that were operating stably. As a result, Harper Industries is now saddled with huge debts, and its reputation has been eroded to an alarming extent. A mixture of anger and disappointment welled up inside me. Anger that my father had gambled away a legacy he had built up over decades, just because of his ego and carelessness. Disappointment that he had not learned from his past mistakes and had not listened. With all the facts gathered, I knew it was time to confront him. I planned a family dinner at the Harper Mansion. I invited my father, mother, and my sister Sophie with one goal: to bring the truth to light. I wanted no more secrets, no more lies. The atmosphere in the dining room was tense. Michael kept his arrogant demeanor, but his eyes were unsettling. He knew something was up. My mother was quietly anxious, picking at her food as if trying to avoid the coming confrontation. As the main meal ended, I took a deep breath and began. Father, I have been carefully reviewing Harper Industries' financial situation these past few days. Michael raised an eyebrow, trying to keep his voice nonchalant. Oh, what's so exciting? Very fascinating, I replied, my voice as sharp as a knife. I have looked closely at the AI project you are pursuing. Can you explain why such an irrational investment is being made in a risky project, lacking both a technological foundation and a clear market model? And why you deliberately ignored the numerous warnings from independent advisors? Michael's face paled. He slammed his hand on the table so hard that the knife and fork rattled. Are you questioning my abilities? What gives you the right to talk to me about the company? Who do you think you are? I am the one who has the responsibility that my grandfather entrusted to me, I replied, calmly but firmly. And I have the right to know why the company is in such dire straits, because of my father's bad decisions. There was no more hiding. Michael's flaws, which he had tried to gloss over, were now exposed. He glared at me, his long, simmering resentment erupting like a volcano. You think you're better than me? He roared, standing up. A fresh graduate who reads a few books and thinks he understands everything? Do you know how much pressure I was under from my grandfather? He always favored you, always gave you everything. Michael launched into a tirade of accusations, blaming his grandfather, blaming me, blaming everyone but himself. Sophie sat silently, curling up as if to disappear from the room. My mother tried to intervene. Michael, calm down. She's just trying to help. But her words of reassurance did nothing to stem the tide of rage that had spiraled out of control. I looked at my father, no longer in anger, but in deep sadness. A sadness that came from the clear realization that he, my role model, had never learned to face his mistakes. He had spent his life blaming and denying responsibility, and that had slowly eaten away at him like rust gnawing at a seemingly sturdy piece of iron. Dinner ended in silence and tension. Michael left, slamming the door angrily. Sophie glanced at me, her eyes wavering between fear and surprise. My mother stayed, squeezing my hand, her voice soft and comforting. "You did the right thing, Emily. There are truths that need to be told." I knew this was just the beginning. This confrontation was necessary to break the mask my father had kept for so long. But the journey ahead would not be easy. I would have to not only revive Harper Industries, but also find a way to heal the deep cracks in my own family. The family dinner showdown was just the opening salvo in a much more brutal war. As Michael's transgressions were exposed, it became clear to me that the old order was impossible. Harper Industries was in freefall and in a catastrophic recession. Without a drastic change, my grandfather's entire legacy would be reduced to ashes in an instant. I had spent days and sleepless nights preparing for the upcoming board meeting. This was not a business meeting, but a battleground for power. My last chance to regain control and restore the Harper family's once proud reputation. I worked tirelessly with my financial and legal advisors, poring over every clause in my grandfather's will, every line in the company's articles of association, and every fatal flaw in Michael's management. I could not afford to slip up. Every proposal had to be precise, uncontroversial, and powerful enough to provide a way out of the dying company. The day of the fateful meeting, the atmosphere at Harper Industries headquarters was suffocating. The large conference room, with its long, polished mahogany table and plush leather chairs, now felt as cold as a courtroom. The faces of the board members, men who had shared the hardships of Harper Industries for decades, were silent, their eyes reflecting fear of an uncertain future. They knew the company was in trouble, but no one could have imagined how close it was to collapse. Michael sat in the chair, his face stiff and tense, but still trying to put on a fake calm. His eyes darted towards me, cold, challenging, as if to say, "You are not strong enough to overthrow me." Clara's mother and Sophie were absent from the meeting, a necessary silence so that I could focus all my attention on this battle. When the financials and business reports came in, red numbers and failed AI projects, I stood up. No prevarication, no blame. I got straight to the point. "Members of the board," I said, my voice clear and resolute. "As you can see, Harper Industries is facing an unprecedented crisis. Bad business decisions, especially our massive investment in unrealistic AI projects, have brought us to the brink of bankruptcy. We cannot continue to blindly follow this path." Michael was about to speak, but I didn't give him the chance to interrupt. I continued. "As the largest shareholder and the person entrusted with the power by William Harper, I have a responsibility to act. After careful consideration, I have developed a comprehensive restructuring plan." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice from shaking. "First, I will inject a significant amount of capital into Harper Industries to restore liquidity and address urgent debt. This capital will come from the personal assets transferred to me by my grandfather, not from any loans." There was a murmur around the table. The additional investment was a positive sign, but I knew they didn't really understand the game I was playing. "In return," I said, looking straight ahead, "my stake in the company will increase to 70%. That gives me absolute control so I can make decisions quickly and efficiently without being hampered by internal squabbles." Michael jumped up as if someone had stabbed him. His face was red with anger. "What? 70%? You're taking over Harper Industries, Emily? This is a robbery." I looked straight at him, my voice calm but heavy as a rock. "No, Father, this is not a robbery. This is a last-ditch effort to save a company that you yourself have driven to the brink of collapse, and this is necessary for us to have a future." I didn't stop. "And second," I said, cutting off any reaction that was forming, "in order to carry out the restructuring in a thorough and transparent manner, I am asking Michael Harper to resign as CEO of Harper Industries, effective immediately." The room froze. My suggestion was a sharp knife cutting through the silence. Michael stood frozen, his face changing color, from red to pale, then to purple with anger. You dare?" He choked as if he couldn't believe his ears. You're going to kick your own father out of your own company? This isn't about father and son, I replied, my words cutting like a knife. This is about the survival of a business with thousands of employees who depend on us to survive. Harper Industries needs a fresh start, and that starts with an outside interim CEO with the ability and vision to lead the company through this dark period. I turned to the council, my eyes determined. I believe this is the only way to revive Harper Industries, to rebuild the reputation and future that William Harper spent his life pursuing. The argument raged. Michael fought back furiously, clinging to his last shred of power like a shipwrecked man clinging to a broken plank. He accused me of betrayal, of ingratitude, of disloyalty. But I had prepared for this moment. I presented every figure, every piece of evidence showing that he had led the company into a dead end. My advisors added cold analysis, pointing out every flaw, every risk of letting Michael continue in power. Finally, the board took a vote in which every nod, every bow, carried the weight of Harper Industries' future. The result, an overwhelming majority in favor of my proposal. Michael collapsed. He sank into his chair, his eyes dull, as if he had just witnessed everything he had built go up in smoke. A historic moment, a new chapter. I, Emily Harper, officially took control of Harper Industries, starting the journey to revive an empire that was once on the brink of destruction. I knew there was a storm ahead, but I was ready. Because in my heart, my grandfather William's legacy still lived on, and I would never let him be ashamed of me. The transfer of power at Harper Industries was not only a major turning point in my career, but also a profound shock to an already fractured family relationship. After a dramatic and tense board meeting, Michael seemed to have completely collapsed. He had withdrawn into his room, shutting out the world, drowning in a mixture of anger and deep disappointment. Clara was bewildered and heartbroken to see him like this, and Sophie hesitated between her shoulders, unsure whose side to take in this cruel change. I knew this was a devastating time for all of us, but it was also a time for things that had been hidden in the shadows of the past to be exposed and confronted. I had anticipated Michael's violent reaction. The loss of absolute power was not only a loss of status, but also a blow to an ego that had been nurtured by legacy and ambition. However, I did not want him to be defeated forever. I wanted him to have a chance to look deeply into himself, to face the wounds that had been eating away at his soul for so many years. With my mother's firm advice and James Carter's sincere advice, I suggested that Michael try psychotherapy. At first, he rejected it without hesitation, thinking it was an insult to his self-esteem. But my mother, a woman of rare patience, gently persuaded him. She said that this was not a trial, but a journey of healing, a way for him to find the peace he had long lost, and who knows, a new direction for his life. Little by little, like water seeping through dry soil, Michael began his first sessions. At first, there was awkward silence, then defensive words. But gradually, he began to open up. He talked about the immense pressure of being Harper, about the heavy shadow of his father, about the feeling of never being good enough, and the jealousy he kept from me. Each word he spoke felt like a sharp knife cutting into old memories. Not just for him, but for me, who was listening. But it was the words that needed to be said, the first step on a journey of cleansing and rebirth. One calm afternoon, Michael invited me into his study, the first time since the reading of the will that he had taken the initiative to speak to me in a calm manner. He sat on his grandfather's faded leather chair, which had once symbolized supreme power, but today, his eyes were no longer cold but were tinged with fatigue, mixed with a deep sadness. "Emily, I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse as if blocked by years. It was the first time I'd heard the word from my father, who was usually reserved and proud. I was wrong. I let ambition cloud my judgment. Fear and jealousy obscure the truth. He paused, his eyes glistening with tears, but he held on to his last shred of dignity. I have done harm to the company, and to you. I have not listened to my grandfather. To you, the person I should have trusted most. I have led Harper Industries astray from the path my grandfather laid out. There was a long pause. Then he sighed. I understand that I can't go back to the CEO position, but if you'll let me, I'd like to continue to contribute, not to run things, but to support them. I can take on a customer advisory role. With my many years of experience in the industry, I believe I can still be useful. Just give me the chance to make some small changes. The offer left me confused. It was more than a career offer. It was a confession. His first bridge across the generational divide. I considered it silently. Despite Michael's many mistakes, I couldn't deny that he had the skills the company needed. More importantly, I wanted to give him a chance to find his own worth, so that he would no longer be a marginalized member of the house he had built. I agree, Father, I said, looking straight at him. But on one condition. All your consulting activities must be transparent, clearly reported, and subject to close supervision by the new board. We need absolute trust to start over. Michael nodded, his eyes shining with a faint but sincere light. I understand. I will do whatever you ask. That was the first brick laid on the path of reconciliation between me and him. A small, fragile step, but enough to start a long journey full of hope. Not only Michael, Sophie also began to change quietly, but clearly. There was a time when she was cold and suspicious of me, partly because of her blind loyalty to her father, partly because of her own disorientation. But when she saw her father fall, and I was steadfast in my efforts to revive the company, she began to look back. I remember that evening she came to me, her eyes heavy with confusion. Emily, I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered, her voice trembling. I feel like I'm drifting. I looked at Sophie for a long time. Start with what makes you happy, Sophie. Grandpa always said, everyone has a seed of talent. It just needs the right soil to plant it. She was silent, then her eyes lit up, as if she had just found a memory that had been covered in dust. My grandfather taught me to sketch cars. When I was little, he said I had a special eye for shape and proportion. I suddenly remembered the long afternoons my grandfather sat on the floor with Sophie, pencil in hand, tracing lines on paper, passionately explaining mechanics and aesthetics. It used to be a simple joy between the two of them, before Sophie got lost in parties and luxury goods. Then get back to it, Sophie, I said gently. Make it your own path. Inspired by her memories of her grandfather, Sophie enrolled in car design courses. She spent hours at the drawing board, researching materials, learning about aerodynamics and green technology. Despite her awkwardness, I saw a new Sophie in her eyes. No longer the dependent young lady, but a woman who was discovering for the first time her own abilities and strengths, who did not need the Harper name to be recognized. And so the first steps of our journey began. Slowly, doubtfully, but steadily. The Harpers, with their scars still raw and their words still unsaid, were once again touching the invisible thread that once bound us. I knew the road ahead would be full of twists and turns, but in my heart, faith had returned. That we, one by one, were learning to love again. Not through fame or power, but through our own truth, vulnerability, and desire to find ourselves. A year has passed since I officially took over Harper Industries, and the atmosphere here has taken on a completely new look. The corridors that were once quiet and filled with anxiety now resound with laughter and positive energy. Projects that had been abandoned were restarted with a clear, transparent, and effective strategy. The interim CEO I chose was an excellent person, with strategic vision and admirable leadership qualities. Under his coordination, with my persistent support, Harper Industries not only revived but also entered a period of unprecedented brilliant development. We boldly eliminated investments that were no longer valuable, focused on strengthening the core area and expanding into potential markets. Quarterly financial reports continuously recorded spectacular growth, and the company's reputation, once doubted, was now rebuilt on a solid and proud foundation. My family, though still rifts from the past, began to heal. My father, Michael, although no longer in an executive role, found a new and meaningful role. He became a senior client advisor, using his extensive experience to maintain strategic relationships. The transparency I imposed not only helped him face responsibility, but also opened the door to restoring trust. The man who had been driven by anger and insecurity was replaced by a calmer, more thoughtful, and more understanding Michael. We still disagreed, but these were respectful discussions, not the bitter, hurtful clashes of the past. My sister Sophie is also on her own journey. Her passion for car design, which she shares with her grandfather, has become her guiding light in life. She is diligently pursuing specialized courses and actively participating in projects at a small car company. In the midst of long working hours in the workshop, her hands stained with paint but her eyes shining with passion, she has found her truest self. Sophie is no longer dependent on her family, but is gradually asserting her independent values, something that I believe Grandpa William would be extremely proud of if he were alive to witness. On a warm, sunny morning, I held a small memorial service for him at Volunteer Park, where he used to walk with me, where he planted my first dreams. Only a few close people were present: Mother Clara, Father Michael, Sophie, and lawyer James Carter. The old tree where he used to say that a company needs deep roots and a strong trunk now grew taller. Its green foliage seemed to protect both memories and the future. I stood silently under that tree, looking at the dear faces around me, my heart filled with thoughts about the word legacy. When I was young, I used to think that his legacy was Harper Industries, a huge fortune. But now I understand that the true value he left behind did not lie in wealth or power. It was the spiritual strength, the steadfast belief he left in me, the lesson of integrity, of creating real value instead of chasing after illusions. His legacy was also unconditional love, sometimes hidden behind a stern appearance, but deeper and more steadfast than any sweet words. He once told me, "Success is not measured by how much money you make, but by the positive impact you leave behind." I understand that now deeply. I'm not only reviving a failing business, but also healing the cracks in our family, allowing each of us to find our own path. That's what complete recovery is. I move forward with unabashed confidence. The road ahead will certainly be difficult, but I know I am not alone. I have the lessons of my grandfather, the resilience of my mother, and now the companionship of Michael and Sophie, who were once broken pieces, but are helping me piece together a more whole family picture. I will continue to develop Harper Industries, not just to make money, but to maintain the true values that my grandfather believed in and pursued all his life. I believe that somewhere, far away but not far away, Grandpa William is watching, smiling with satisfaction. Because the granddaughter he once raised has now taken on that legacy, not only with a sharp mind, but also with a heart that was once broken but is now beating again, strong and complete.